Hi, I'm Andrew.
And I'm Dave, and we're the IB English guys. This is our second video of our Paper 2 series from start to finish. So if you missed our first video, be sure to watch that. It's about the nuts and bolts of the Paper 2. We also want to remind you that this Paper 2 video series is really to give you a slice of our Paper 2 resource, which is, again, a part of our whole school resources.
Yeah, our learners have been very successful with these resources. We lead them through the entire assessment model, start to finish, for each component, so we would like to have you come along with us for the ride so you too can be successful in your IB endeavors. Mr. Giles, today we're going to talk about a family supper.
Yeah, we like this story very much, so if you haven't had time to read it, make sure you have, because I think you'll get more out of the video. Again, this is a rich story by Kazuo Ishiguro. He's a Nobel Prize-winning author. And he's somebody who has created a very rich text with a lot of rich symbols. To give you a brief synopsis, this is a story about post-war Japan. It takes place in Japan. A young man is returning back to his family home. He's returning back to his father and his sister. His mother has died. And again, he's lived in California. He's had this Western experience, and now he's coming back to visit his somewhat traditional and very kind of emotionally guarded father.
Mr. Giles, that was a pretty fantastic synopsis. I think you've read this story a few times.
I have. I love this story. It's got a lot of tension, and it's got a lot of generational differences, and it's got a lot of culture in it.
Now, like the text you have studied or the text you're thinking about for Paper 2, this is a really rich text, and our purpose today is not to teach you the nuts and bolts of a family supper, but rather we want to show you how to use a graphic organizer and break down a rich text into smaller parts, smaller broad authorial choices, which you can then use in your comparative Paper 2 analysis. This is what we talk about of the we go, you go mentality. So today we're going to go through our graphic organizer for our text, and then in the video description is a blank organizer that you, your classmates, your teacher, you can go over together and fill out the broad authorial choices and the ideas for your text.
Yeah.
Does that make sense, Mr. Giles?
That's great. I like to see this as this is your foundation of your literary text. So before you're going to compare it with another text, get a rich understanding.
Yeah, there's no comparative work until you've done what we call a one text organizer. You do one text, you do the other text, then you can start doing those rich comparisons, not before.
Yeah, again. So the first thing we want to think about in our chart is really understanding the author. And again, these are just some broad things that we want to think about with respect to the author. These things can be useful to help us have a starting place. Kazuo Ishiguro is a British Asian author, so he grew up in the UK. He's a Nobel Prize winner, so he's really has lots of critical acclaim, and his texts are very rich. And really, he himself was born in Japan, but he lived overseas, and I think that international experience he brings that out in a lot of his work.
So the idea here is that when you're thinking about your Paper 2 text and completing your organizer, you want to think about, is there any key biographical or author information that would be critical to help you answer a question? Maybe you're studying the Kite Runner, Mr. Giles. The fact that Khaled Hosseini was born in Afghanistan but grew up in America and is now writing a novel about Afghanistan, that has implications for the way we might answer questions. This is useful information.
Yeah, it's so useful. It's really, I think, again, that comes into the understanding. Now we want to think about the context and setting. Every text has a time and a place. This is one of our areas of exploration. So we want to think about that. In this case, in A Family Supper, this is, again, modern day Japan, but it's post-World War II. This is part of the setting that we want to think about. It's also Kamakura, Japan. Kamakura has a lot of rich cultural significance in Japan.
Right, so you want to be thinking about, in your text, where has the author placed the story? What is the setting? Talk about the context, and how is that relevant to answering different types of questions?
One more thing about setting with this particular story is that it takes place in a traditional Japanese home. It's fairly dark, it's fairly empty, and he's got the garden in the background. So these are all the sort of rich aspects of setting that are not just context.
Yeah, you get a question about atmosphere. This is the box you want to come back to and think about, what did you put in this box before you do that comparative analysis? Mr. Giles, it's really important to think about narrative point of view when we look at any text. Can you talk a little bit about some of the different narrative perspectives and what we could glean from completing this box?
Oh, great question. So this story is first person point of view, and that narrative point of view is so important because you're seeing the story through the eyes of the son who returns home. He's talking about his experiences with his father, with his sister.
But with that first-person point of view, what could you be missing as a reader?
You might be missing what the father feels, right? Because you have to make some inferences about that. So you're seeing everything through their eyes. So again, the point of view of a text is a really rich comparative idea later, but it's one to think about that.
These are our broad authorial choices, which make up the backbone of the paper too, okay? You also want to make sure that you can do a really clear synopsis or plot review, and you can see that in the next box here. We're not going to go through this in great detail to break down the entire plot of A Family Supper, but the idea here is that with your text, you need to make sure you have identified those critical plot points. What's in the exposition? What's the inciting incident? Rising action, climax, falling action, resolution. Where are those elements in your text? And make sure that you can pin these moments to specific thematic ideas and then talk about those features.
Yeah, we call it a walkthrough oftentimes, where we have students walk through the text so they can really, without notes, be able to summarize what happened.
Yeah, teachers, make sure your kids are regularly walking through the text without notes. That helps them internalize a story and it makes them better able to handle all these questions on paper too.
Yeah, that's great. We want to also think about the narrative structure. We want to think about, again, how does the writer structure this text? Is it written chronologically? Is it written in a non-linear fashion? How can we look at the structure of the text?
Did the author drop you into the middle of the story at the beginning? Is the ending ambiguous? You can think about beginning, middle, and end as well, as opposed to just, how is it chronologically structured? It's really important to talk about narrative structure.
Time's a sophisticated idea. In this particular story, this story is just from midday when the son arrives to the end of the evening when he's ready to take the family supper.
And you can compare that to a novel like Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi, which spans multiple generations. This is in a day or two, right? So the time is really important to think about.
That's right.
Go ahead.
You want to think about characters. Again, characters are so rich to talk about. So in this particular story, we want to think about the father. The father's unnamed, which I think is kind of interesting. He's a very formidable man with furious black eyebrows. That was a quote that I thought was interesting.
You still remember the quotes, huh?
Yeah, he's proud of being Japanese, and he's proud of his samurai blood. There's a lot of references to the samurai code and the idea of honor. That's such a rich part of Japanese culture.
When we think about characterization, we want to think about subcategories as well. You might want to think about what a character says. You might want to think about what a character thinks, the character's effect on others, their actions, or the character's looks. There's an acronym, STEEL, which can be really helpful to really think about characterization in great detail.
That's right. We want to think about the son. Again, the son, his sister, his mother, and Watanabe. These are all characters in this story that, again, have some rich detail. To be able to unpack and understand each character, so important.
Definitely. Not just characters, Mr. Giles, but conflicts are critical as well. We know we have loads of different kinds of conflicts. We've been studying since middle school. For me, these conflicts are really important parts of the novel or whatever text you're studying. You'll often find these thematic moments right where the conflict is. The author may choose to accentuate these moments through conflict.
Yeah.
Can you talk about some of the conflicts in A Family Supper?
Absolutely. So a lot of times we have the conflict between the generational conflicts. So we have the father-daughter conflict that exists. We also have the father-son, which I think is the central conflict, with the son that's come back and his father who's traditional, and the conflict and the inability to understand. But also the father has a conflict with himself. And again, he's struggling. He's struggling to see all the changes that Japan is undergoing and trying to deal with the fact that his son has left.
Yeah,
and his insecurity of that.
For sure. You definitely want to spend some time going through the conflicts with your classmates and your teacher and be clear here and really think about which rich thematic ideas can I anchor to these points. And that does take us to themes, Mr. Giles. I like to think about topics first. We talk about sort of topics and themes in this box.
Yeah. So we want to think about, again, thinking about a topic like cultural heritage, like the idea of culture as a topic. But then the theme would be, what is at play here and the sort of cultural differences that exist because of the westernization. So the topic might be cultural heritage, but the theme is that rich conflict that exists.
I like to think of the sentence stems. This is a text about, that gives you the topic. And then what does the author communicate about this topic? That's your theme. That's a good way to think about that.
Yeah, we can also, this is a lot about grief and loss. There's aspects of suicide in this text, aspects of death and loss, because they're recovering over the loss of their mother. And again, this idea of grief is the topic, but again, the struggle to overcome that grief is really what the story is about. So again, these are topics and themes that we see.
Yeah.
We also have rich symbols. Symbols are fun to talk about.
Yeah, I think regardless of what text you've read, you will be looking at symbols in great detail, and these can form the cornerstones of many of your paragraphs. Obviously, in A Family Supper, we see the fugu, which is that dangerous fish that we're unsure about. We see the battleship, the well, ghosts. So you want to think about what are the prominent symbols in your paper 2 text, and what do they reveal about the topics of the text, and what do they reveal about the thematic messages of the text as well. Now we're getting the stuff that I love, Mr. Jaws, the how. We know that the author's doing all these things. What are some more things? Notable craft. What can we talk about with notable craft?
Yeah, we like to think of signature moves. What are the signature moves that Ishiguro makes in a family supper that we can draw from and use for a myriad of paper 2 questions? This is why this is so important to get a grounding in how does this writer do that? One thing that Ishiguro does, he uses the motif of darkness. There's a lot of light and dark in this story, and the darkness creates a sense of mystery. It also creates a sense of kind of mourning and loss and death, and the darkness is there. There's also incredible like tension and strained dialogue. The dialogue is awkward. There's so many unspoken things between this father and the son. All these are signature moves that we can draw out and talk about.
Yeah.
Talk about a couple of more, like some of the.
Yeah, I like to think about this story, and it has a very non-traditional beginning. It sort of gives a definition of fugu and the implications of fugu, and then it has a really ambiguous ending. These are trademark moves by Ishiguro. He's very ambiguous. He doesn't just give you the idea. He makes you struggle and work with it a little bit, really exercise that critical thinking muscle.
Yeah. A lot of the last thing we have in our chart, and again, a lot of students always ask us, do we have to memorize quotes? Do we have to memorize quotes? And I think the answer is no, you're not required to memorize, like 100 quotes for your literary text. However, it's nice to walk away with some what we call nuggets of language from the story that we can commit to memory and think about that we can recall for a paper 2. So I'll give you some examples. One is he calls his father a formidable looking man. He's formidable. He's intimidating. That's the son describing his father. I can use that phrase, easy to remember. What are some other words?
Mr. Jaws, there are other things besides work. Like for me, that's a really important line of this text, and I didn't study that. I just remember it because it was a really impactful moment. So the more times you read the text and the more familiar you are with the text, these notable nuggets, you don't need to study these. They'll just stick in your mind, and you can use these in your paper 2 response.
Yeah, his sister says, I'm dying for a smoke. Again, this idea of a young Japanese girl going out for a smoke, and the way she says that so informally shows that she's kind of rebelling away from her culture. And again, I think that's just like, it stuck out in my memory.
It's a fantastic story. I love this story. Now, folks, in the end, if you look at the video description, you'll see a blank graphic organizer down there for you. We would encourage you to go over this either on your own, with a friend, with a group of friends, as a whole class. It could be a collaborative Google Doc. The choice is yours, but the idea is before you could even dream to write a comparative paper 2 response, you have to make sure you understand the content, the form, the broad authorial choices, and the main ideas of your text 1 first. So we encourage you to take this chart. This is we went, now you go with your chart.
Yeah, and feel free to use ours. We'll link our complete chart. You can have a look in more detail. We went through some of the aspects. You can see kind of our thinking and use that as a model and make yours even better.
So folks, this takes us through video 2 of our start to finish paper 2. We'll see you back in the next video where we'll go over the second story, and then we'll start doing that rich comparative work, but not until we understand each text independently. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.
Good luck, guys.